In the hot summer of 1666, the City of London was consumed by a great fire. 13,000 houses were destroyed. 89 churches were incinerated. 80% of the building stock was erased. No other city had burned like this since Roman times. The story passed down to us says the fire was an accident, started in a bakery in Pudding Lane. That Mr. Fariner, the royal baker, had left some embers still burning near his ovens. That London's wooden buildings were a tinderbox, fanned by unseasonably hot gales. Poor Mr. Fariner. It was all a terrible accident. But that wasn't how it appeared to Londoners at the time.
From the very beginning, Londoners were convinced that this was a deliberate attack. And from the very beginning, they wanted to know who'd done it.
Prejudices are rather like viruses in the human body. They can appear to lie dormant for periods and then suddenly flame up and spread. But the Great Fire turns what is a kind of low-level, flickering suspicion into a bonfire.
It's almost natural to try to blame somebody for it. And who can you blame? You pick a foreigner.
People become incredibly violent. It is mob rule.
Mobs beat them, they tried to lynch them, they arrested them, until it wasn't safe to be a foreigner in London.
Less than 3 weeks after the fire had been quenched, the House of Commons appointed a committee to inquire into the causes of the disaster. Their collection of eyewitness accounts has survived to this day, deep in London's Guildhall.
A true and faithful account is the report of a parliamentary committee of inquiry that was set up after the fire to find someone to blame, to look for the truth, to see what really happened on that fateful week at the beginning of September 1666. The voices that emerge in this document are authentic. They are the voices of ordinary people with all the fear and prejudice and shock. They are the voice of London.
A constable took a Frenchman firing a house.
There were 300 Frenchmen that were in a plot or conspiracy to fire the city.
I searched the fellow, found a horn of powder about him. He also had about him a book entitled The Jewish Government.
The people cried out, "He is a Frenchman! Kill him!"
I apprehended a walloon with an instrument filled with gunpowder. There were 2 more of the same nation in his company.
The picture that emerges from this inquiry is of a people that are out for, they want the truth, they want to know who has destroyed their city, and they want justice.
The original crime, as Londoners saw it, had been committed at Fariner's Bakery in Pudding Lane.
This is where the story starts. Between 1 and 2 in the morning on Sunday the 2nd of September 1666, the King's baker, Thomas Fariner, was woken up by a manservant. There was smoke coming up from the ground floor, from the bakery itself. When they tried to get downstairs, they couldn't. They were beaten back. Thomas, his daughter Hannah, his son and a manservant were forced to clamber out onto a windowsill. The gales fanned the flames spread, and very soon it was obvious that this was more than just another house fire. The parish constables called out the Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, a representative of the Vintners Company, and really the man in charge of the City of London. His first reaction, the words that put him in the history books, were, "A woman could piss this fire out." Farriner's maidservant was too frightened to clamber out on the windowsill. She was scared of heights. She was the first victim of the Fire of London. We don't even know her name.
To the frightened and confused people of London, the start of this fire looked anything but accidental.
It's broken out at the wrong time in the wrong place. It's broken out in the early hours of the morning. It's right next to huge stores of inflammable materials, and it takes out the great water wheel from the Thames, which pumps up water almost immediately. This looks premeditated. And because it's been lit at just the wrong moment in terms of weather, that also looks like a terrorist act.
Pudding Lane was a perfect location to set a deliberate fire. The buildings were very close together. There'd been a drought, all the buildings were dry, the timbers were dry. It was up a hill, so you'd have a natural draft coming up that hill to help fan the flames. It would also be a good place to hide from an arsonist's point of view. On top of that, it would have been an ideal place to set a deliberate fire and make it look like an accident, because bakers in those days were a very dangerous place to work.
The way the fire behaved next further fueled the suspicion of ordinary Londoners.
Well, Thomas Middleton was standing down near 3 Cranes Walk, I believe, and was looking up towards the northeast of the city, and he witnessed fire which appeared to be just erupting from inside buildings.
I repaired to the top of a church steeple, where I observed the fire did break forth out of several houses, when the houses that were then burning were at a good distance from them, every way. And more particularly, I saw the fire break out from the inside of Lawrence Pulteney steeple, when there was no fire near it. These and such like observations begat in me a persuasion that the fire was maintained by design.
The flames were spreading along Thames Street and into the city, but they weren't just spreading in a line. Fires were breaking out all over London in separate incidents. And as far as Londoners were concerned, there was only one explanation for that: arson. It had to be a deliberate attack. At the same time, was it a coincidence that the water wheels were destroyed? Was it a coincidence that the waterhouse up at Islington had its doors locked and the watercocks had been turned off? People said it couldn't be a coincidence. All those things must have been happening for a reason, and that reason was enemy action.
As the flames take hold, Londoners spend a surprisingly little amount of time fighting the fire. They spend rather more time looking for foreigners to blame.
Day 2 of the Great Fire, and 1,000 houses in the square mile had burnt. The ports were closed, and word spread that a foreign army had landed to take advantage of the vulnerable city. The subsequent parliamentary inquiry into the fire reveals that it started in Pudding Lane. But nobody blamed the baker for accidentally causing it. It was, as they saw it, an attack by foreign enemies, and one community was a prime suspect above all others: the Dutch.
The Dutch were miles and miles ahead of any other nation. Amsterdam was considered the capital of the world. The Dutch language was considered a world language, and English just as a second-rank language, derived from the Dutch. Economically, the country did extremely well. The Dutch and the English were each other's necks as two Protestant countries because of the trade routes, and increasingly because of the colonial trade routes, because that's where all the money was made.
By the summer of 1666, commercial rivalry had erupted into open warfare.
In August 1666, a naval force under Sir Robert Holmes, a flamboyant character who used to wear a gold lace suit and carry a monkey on his shoulder, a force sailed into the harbour at Terschelling on the Dutch coast.
They arrived completely unexpected. There were about 150 Dutch ships there. He'd attacked Dutch commercial navy, more or less destroyed most of the ships, entered the islands, emptied the warehouses, and set fire to houses, committed atrocity, and killed many people.
Even in the brutal 17th century, this was a terrible thing to do. But back in London, it was seen as an enormous victory. And people danced in the street. Sir Robert Holmes's bonfire, as it was called, and people lit bonfires in London to celebrate our victory over the Dutch. So when a couple of weeks later, the fire broke out, it was only natural that everybody thought the Dutch had got us back. It was a retaliatory strike.
The rumor that went around quite quickly, it was that the Dutch had taken deliberate revenge on the English by setting fire to London.
Suspicions about Dutch vengeance surfaced in the parliamentary inquiry. A Wiltshire farmer testified about an ominous threat he'd heard in the days before the fire started.
You are brave blades. You made bonfires lately for beating the Dutch. But since you delight in bonfires, you shall have your bellies full of them. If you live 1 week longer, you shall see London, as sad a London as ever it was since the world began.
Lady Hobart, who lived in Chancery Lane, wrote to her country cousin and said, "Poor London is burnt down. It began in Pudding Lane at a bakery where a Dutch rogue lay."
No Dutch rogue had been found in Pudding Lane, but by Monday lunchtime, the Lord Chancellor reported that it was the universal conclusion the fire had been started and was being spread by the Dutch. And there were plenty of suspects to choose from.
There were bakers, there were brewers, there were haberdashers, they were in the textile industry, the whole silk industry is part of it. It was a whole range of professional jobs and skills that brought wisdom to England.
The fire was only a day old and so had not reached Westminster, but it was travelling at 30 yards an hour in that direction. Here, a Dutchman was raising suspicion.
Flames and smoke were seen coming from a Dutchman's house. This was the house of Cornelius Rietveld, and Cornelius Rietveld was a baker.
Cornelius Rietveld had lived in London for more than a decade, lying low, fitting in, raising a young family. With 5 children under the age of 11, Rietveld was an upstanding member of the Dutch Church. But as the fire raged, he no longer looked so innocent.
Everybody was on such a high state of alert that they immediately suspected that he was setting alight to buildings. And what he was doing was part of an enemy action.
The average Londoner's attitude towards aliens is mixed. In good years, aliens are funny and foreign and entertaining. They have slightly peculiar clothes and strange accents, and they can be laughed at in the street or simply ignored. When times get tense in terms of religion, economy, politics, society, booting the foreigner is a great first resort when nerves start to break.
Cornelius was saved by a passerby. He was taken for his own safety and put in a prison cell where nobody could reach him. Well, you never know, but his life might have been saved.
Londoners were divided on the subject of immigration. Many welcomed a new, industrious workforce.
There was a real movement to encouraged immigration into England. People thought that there were not enough people in the country. So if you encourage immigration by using naturalization, you would encourage a lot of people who would bring in their skills and money to this country. On the other hand, there was an anti-immigration camp who felt that if aliens were going to come to this country and enjoyed the same kind of rights as Englishmen, a lot of the people would be disadvantaged or would lose out.
Keeping England for the English carried a lot of currency in the 1660s, as this petition to Parliament shows.
So what it says is that these people are only here for economic reasons. They do not want to mix with us. They do not want to go to the same church as us, and they do not want to intermarry with us. The documents summed up by saying that aliens should not be naturalised because, as they put it, these gentlemen will be only summer birds amongst us. When they've filled their pockets, or if trouble or wars arise, they will not forget their native countries and may be instruments of much inconvenience unto His Majesty and His dominions. It means that they will not see England as their home, but will return to their countries after they make their fortunes in this country. And they should not be trusted because if there's trouble, they might be acting as instruments of their country. So they could be potential spies for England's enemies.
As the growing fire engulfed thousands more homes, one Dutch family was arousing exactly this kind of suspicion. In Lime Street, so close to the Eastern Front line, they hastily removed their possessions.
Lime Street at a particular time we're speaking was a very, very rich area. These were the successful immigrants, the financiers, the scientists, some artists lived there. And it was an area where many of the leading minds in the immigrant community would come together.
Johan van der Merch and his wife Alida had lived in Lime Street for 12 years. They'd made a fortune in the cloth and haberdashery trade. Alida's brother Peter and his new wife Jane lived just a few doors down.
When the fire started, he was able to procure carts, and these were very hard to get as they cost a lot of money and they were very scarce, and it was one of the only ways in which people could get their goods out of the burning city.
A Dutch merchant reported spending £60 for 3 carts, the equivalent of £7 today. Other Londoners couldn't get carts for love or money, but Van der Merch could.
His neighbours would have perhaps started asking questions when they saw him and his family loading carts up with their worldly goods. It looked as if he perhaps had prior knowledge.
In 2 dark days, the ties that normally bound one neighbour to another were broken. Tens of thousands were now homeless. The fire was gathering pace, and Londoners needed someone to blame.
They're deeply paranoid. They're looking for the people that they're convinced were responsible for destroying their city. The parliamentary inquiry, for example, heard evidence from a Michael March, and he said that he apprehended a Walloon in the time of the fire at the Nag's Head in Leadenhall Street with an instrument like a dark lantern made to lay a train of powder, and it was filled with gunpowder. There's your evidence.
But an awful lot of foreigners haven't heard the rumours, and so they are out on the street trying to fight the fire, trying to get their goods away, or simply trying to see what's going on, and that immediately makes them vulnerable if there is somebody half crazed in a crowd nearby.
And then the mob turns on them. There are no questions asked. It comes out of a type of terror.
Within hours of the fire, foreigners were going into hiding.
Their fear was of Londoners, people who had lived side by side with them until that Sunday morning, People who called them friends and neighbours until that Sunday morning. Now they were the enemy.
It's apocalyptic. Mass hysteria broke out. Climbing over heaps of ashes. Nobody is going to be calm and level-headed in this type of environment.
There is total chaos, and where you get chaos, anything can happen.
There was this one Swedish nobleman who was becoming particularly anxious about his mistress somewhere in the city, and decided he would hazard an attempt to go and find her to make sure she was okay, or perhaps he was just feeling a bit lonely. But he went out, and because he looked different, because he didn't look like an average Londoner, because he obviously looked foreign, the mob set upon him. The lynchings give you an insight into the mindset. They were just panicking. It was fanatical.
Sources tell us that the Swedish nobleman was saved from the makeshift gallows. But could Londoners, witnessing the destruction of their property and their fundamental way of life, be saved from themselves? Fueled by hot gales, London's firestorm had entered its third day. Violent mobs had taken to the streets, flushing out the foreign agents they believed were responsible. No Dutch fire starter had been found, so they turned to the next suspect, England's traditional enemy, the French.
The default prejudice of the medieval and earlier modern English are the French. There are great traditional medieval enemies. We'd fought them for longer than anybody else. And they also happen to be, though we hate to admit it, a richer, more populous, more powerful, more dangerous neighbour than anybody else.
The bulk of the parliamentary inquiry, the bulk of the true and faithful account, the report that comes out of the parliamentary inquiry, targets France. So, for example, Mrs. Elizabeth Stiles informs Parliament that in April last, in an eager discourse she had with a French servant, he replied, "You English maids will like the Frenchman better when there is not a house left between Temple Bar and London Bridge. This will come to pass between June and October."
The most suspicious Frenchman of all at this time was a man by the name of Monsieur Belland. Monsieur Belland was a firework maker for the king. Of course, he works with gunpowder and all sorts of incendiary things. Well, naturally, the eye of suspicion is going to fall on him. Only a few days before the fire, he went to go get pasteboard to make fireworks and was told that there would be some delay in getting it, and he complained that he really needed it for this weekend. It was very important, and if he couldn't get his hands on it, there was really no point.
He was asked by a citizen, what did he want with all that pasteboard? And he said that he made fireworks for the king's pleasure, which he did. But he also said that there was going to be a great firework display which would illuminate St. Paul's, and it was going to take place the next week. And the next week, St. Paul's was illuminated, but not in a way that anybody dreamt.
Suspicion of the French went beyond politics and war. It was about something that had tormented the English for the past century: religious fundamentalism.
By definition, the Protestant Reformation turns the Roman Catholic Church into the bad religion against which Protestants define themselves, and the English are no exception. After all, in much of the reign of Elizabeth, Catholics are trying to murder the monarch, and they send an armada against us. In the reign of James VI and I, they try and blow up the entire ruling class in the Gunpowder Plot. And an awful lot of English Protestants blame the Catholics for the English Civil War, which had raged through the 1640s. So they are the obvious national enemy. They are the Antichrist. They are the definition not just of a religion that's actually fashioned by the devil to take people to hell as fast as possible. They're also the enemies of English liberties, British democracy, our basic ideals and rights going back to Magna Carta, or so ordinary English people of the age believe.
The violence against the French exploded, red and raw, onto the streets.
There was talk of arsonists all over the city. William Taswell, a 14-year-old schoolboy, mentioned a Frenchman that was caught in Moorfields with an arm full of firebombs. The ratty tennis balls. Young William Taswell talked of how he saw a blacksmith walk up to a Frenchman in the street and strike him across the head with an iron bar. And he still remembered, 60 years later, he remembered how that poor man fell into the gutter and the blood streamed down around his ankles.
Meeting a Frenchman walking along the street, I could not help seeing the innocent blood of this exotic flowing in a plentiful stream.
There's a horrible kind of casualness about the way in which London rage against foreigners suddenly explodes with the fire burning. Probably the most atrocious single incident concerns a woman in Moorfields, north of London, who's walking in towards the city carrying some chicks in her apron. Some maniac gets the impression that these are fireballs. A mob runs towards her. The chicks get away, so she can't actually show them and explain what's really happening. And they beat her savagely and cut off her breasts. The casual violence against people in the streets or in the fields outside indicate that some Londoners are simply losing their reason. They're seeing their entire world literally going up in smoke in front of their eyes. They can't believe that this is natural, that this is normal, that this is something they can explain in any way other than evil human beings. And so they're looking for demons in human form walking their streets.
So naturally, the mob went looking for their prime suspect, Monsieur Belland, the French firework maker.
They find his shop empty. But they follow his servants. They follow them across London, through a smoking London, until those servants reach the Palace of Whitehall. They follow those servants into the Palace of Whitehall, down the corridors, up the stairs. And suddenly, old Monsieur Belland himself pops his head out and says, "What are you doing here? What are you doing here? I'm not under arrest here. I'm not the criminal, nor is my son." He says, "We are no common prisoners, but lodged here to prevent us from the rage of the common people."
Belland had found refuge at the royal court in Whitehall. It turned out the king and his brother, the Duke of York, had been protecting foreigners, and Catholics in particular, from London's rage.
Over and over again, one hears the same phrase: a Frenchman was taken firing a house. And then one hears he was taken by the Duke of York's lifeguards. A constable took a Frenchman firing a house. He seized on him and, going to a magistrate with him, met His Royal Highness the Duke of York, who asked the reason of this tumult. The Duke of York called for the man. He spoke to him in French. And the Duke said, I'm taking this man into custody. And the Frenchman wasn't seen again. What they were doing is rescuing people, but the mob didn't see it like that. The culprits were being taken away from them, from their justice. Were they being spirited away? Were they being whisked out of the country? Were they being protected?
Perhaps the answer to that question lay at the front line of the fire, where small groups of brave firefighters fought vainly against overwhelming odds. And at their head was James, Duke of York.
During the Great Fire of London, the Duke of York behaves like a hero. He's Lord High Admiral, which means he commands the warships more than the Thames. And so he brings up sailors from the fleet who are used to running up rigging and putting up masts, and gets them hard at work demolishing houses and pumping water. And he's there himself.
Increasingly, the Duke of York used his lifeguards as snatch squads to rescue these hapless Frenchmen, to whisk them away. Of course, what that did, it increased the mob's suspicion.
But before the mob could investigate this royal treason any further, news arrived from the East End. News that would vindicate the mob's base instinct.
Just as the mob violence started to subside a little, a young watchmaker called Robert Hubert was caught in Essex trying to get out of the country. He was brought before a magistrate and he said, I did it. It was me. I started the Fire of London. This was exactly what Londoners had suspected, and all their suspicions suddenly seemed to be confirmed. It was a plot. It was a Catholic plot. It was a French Catholic plot. Everybody said, I told you so. Robert Hubert of Rouen, Normandy, who acknowledged that he was one of those that fired the house of Mr. Fariner, a baker in Pudding Lane, from whence the fire had its beginning, confessed that he came out of France with one Stephen Pedlow about 4 months before the fire, and then they came together into England in a Swedish ship called the Skipper, where he stayed on board with the said Pedlow till that Saturday night in which the fire brake out. When Pedlow, taking him out of the ship, carried him into Pudding Lane, and then he told him that he had bought 3 balls and gave him one of them to throw into the house. And then he did the fact, which was that he put a fireball at the end of a long pole and, lighting it with a piece of match, he put it in at a window and stayed till he saw the house in a flame. Confessed that there were 23 accomplices, whereof Pedlow was the chief.
Hubert's confession was just what Londoners had suspected. It implied a serious, well-organised plot. But his claims had to be investigated. Hubert's jailer, John Lohman, instructed the watchmaker to show him the scene of the crime.
Here stood the house, he said. The jailer endeavoured to draw him from that belief and put him upon seeking for some other place. But he positively persisted in what he had first said and affirmed that to have been the said house.
What the jailer did was good practice, and it's practice now. He went out of his way to disprove that Hubert had set the fire by trying to distract him from where Hubert was saying the bakery was. Based on the jailer's evidence, it's pretty damning for Hubert, and when I read that, I really believed that this could have been an arson fire.
Hubert's evidence made sense to a battered city. Under due process, he was convicted of starting the Great Fire of London and sentenced to death. Londoners believed they'd got their man, but the trouble wasn't over for London's foreigners. Over 3 days and nights, the fire had grown so immense that it had leapt across the city walls to the west. With nearly 13,000 houses burnt, London was now in the eye of a perfect firestorm that threatened everything within its reach.
Because of the prevailing winds, the fire moved westward, but it crept to the east as well. And creeping to the east meant that it crept towards the Tower of London.
Had the flames reached the tower, there'd have been the greatest explosion in the entire early modern period, because the tower is the magazine of the nation. It's where the munitions to arm the armed forces are kept. So that had those great piles of combustible material gone up, it would have been like an atomic bomb.
A vast number of dispossessed people pitched up in places like Islington and Highgate, where they could sit and watch the fire on the horizon in kind of tent cities, sitting there completely shocked by what had happened, covered in ash, miserable, terrified.
The Dutch families of Lime Street had joined this mass exodus, fueling suspicions about where their true loyalties lay. But they were seen in a very different light when they returned to help fight the raging inferno. Lime Street was now on the front line of the fight to save the tower, and with it, the city.
When it became obvious to Van der Meulen that his house could not be saved, or not completely saved, he used one of the few tools available to him, the fire hooks, to bring down part of the house to try to stop the flames going further down the street. What he did was sacrifice his own property in order to save other properties from the fire.
Now, anybody that will do that has got to be, in the highest public spirit, a hero, because those actions certainly stopped the fire spreading. So it was a very, very selfless act.
After 4 days of conflagration and violence, the Great Fire of London burnt itself out. It never reached the tower because foreigners and their English neighbours made great personal sacrifices. But the battle to live in peace in London wasn't over. Denied the right to rebuild their homes and their lives, some foreign Londoners took their fight to the courts.
John Van der Mesch, an alien merchant, had his house burned down by the fire, and he was looking to renew his lease so he could rebuild the house. But his landlord refused on the ground that he was an alien enemy.
When Van der Mesch took the landlord to court, it's quite heartwarming in a way to see that there were so many local people who were prepared to come to court and support him, tell the court about, his heroism, about his willingness to sacrifice, to help, and basically, you know, what a good citizen he had been.
The city, I think, was very clever in a way. Johann van der Merch wanted the lease, and so they gave him the house he wanted. But they also gave him another, I suppose, demolished house on the condition that he would rebuild a better house in its place.
London needed every single penny they could find. And it's interesting that so many of the rich immigrants, and the rich in general, but the immigrants in particular, were willing to help in the actually rebuilding of London.
Johann van der Merch died 3 years after the Great Fire, but the city gave his brother-in-law, Peter van den Anker, an even greater reward.
In recognition of his great contribution to the rebuilding of the City of London, he was given the freedom of the city, and the costs were paid for by the city as well. So I think this was important because it's an ultimate sign of acceptance into London society.
Other victims of the mob's rage made their peace with London too.
Cornelius Rietveld, once he was released, and it was obvious that, you know, he was not involved at all, he returned to his business, to his home, and found everything destroyed. However, he did stay in London. There is a record that another of his child was baptized in the church, and he must have rebuilt his business nearby, probably amidst the very people that had robbed and destroyed his previous business.
So that London would never forget the destruction of the Great Fire, a monument was built near Pudding Lane, where the fire started.
The monument, it's always called just the monument, but it's not only a memorial to the fire of London, it's a memorial to the men and women who helped to save London, and more importantly perhaps, the men and women who helped to rebuild London.
But the monument also became a focus for London's righteous anger, to remind Londoners of the foreign enemies in their midst.
There was a plaque here which read, "Here by permission of heaven, hell broke loose on this Protestant city from the malice of barbarous papists whose fires are not yet quenched."
The lame French watchmaker Robert Hubert's name was etched here as the bloody foreigner who London believed started the Great Fire. He was hanged on the 29th of October 1666, just weeks after the fire was extinguished.
The mob's malice doesn't end with Hubert's death. According to the Venetian ambassador, at least, Londoners tore Hubert's corpse limb from limb.
But not everyone believed that the Frenchman had actually done it. Hubert's innocence was confirmed by the captain of the ship which had brought him to London. Hubert hadn't even been in the city when the fire broke out.
There's absolutely no reason to believe that Hubert was anything other than a nutcase. Somebody who's effectively committing suicide while making himself world famous, even at the cost of his own life.
But Hubert had insisted on his guilt, and London had exacted her revenge.
The rage to blame lasted long after the flames had gone out. It lasted, in fact, for close on 160-odd years. It wasn't until 1829 that that plaque finally came down.
By which time, London had decided to write the whole thing off. The Great Fire was an unfortunate accident, started in Farriner's Bakery in Pudding Lane. And so London was able to develop into the cosmopolitan and commercially vibrant city we know today.